This is Meet the Writers. I'm Georgina Godwin. My guest today is an Arab Jew. He's also an emeritus professor of international relations at the University of Oxford and a fellow of the British Academy. His books include Collusion Across the Jordan, King Abdullah, the Zionist Movement and the Partition of Palestine, War and Peace in the Middle East, A Concise History, The Iron Wall, Israel and the Arab World, Israel and Palestine, Reappraisals, Revisions, Refutations, and his most recent, Three Worlds, Memoir of an Arab Jew. Avi Shlaim, welcome to Meet the Writers.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, you are an academic, you're an historian, and all of your books up to this point have been written in that style. Now we have a memoir that combines both of those things, though. Tell us why.
So, as you say, my last book is a very unusual book given my profile and 50 years as an academic when I wrote only scholarly books, mostly on the Arab-Israeli conflict. And they were fairly straightforward. I would have a chronology, and then it's one damn thing after another, like The Iron Wall, Israel and the Arab World, of which there is a second edition, updated edition, which is 900 pages long. So I followed a chronology. And I also wrote a biography of King Hussein of Jordan. And once again, I had a chronology, and the book almost wrote itself. But this last book was different because it was an autobiography, and I didn't know how to write about myself, and I hesitated for a long time before embarking on this. But it's not a conventional autobiography, and it only goes up to when I was 18, and I'm not an important person, but I lived in important times, and I had unusual experiences in being a Jew in an Arab country who then moved to Israel and grew up in Israel. So the book, I think of it as an impersonal autobiography. The first half is about my family and the Jews in Iraq, set against the wider background of Iraqi history in the first half of the 20th century. And the second half is about myself. And my wife read the book chapter by chapter as I was writing it. And one day she said to me, Avi, I'm very worried. I'm on chapter 5 and you weren't born yet. And I said to her, that's the whole point. It's an attempt to interweave the personal with the political.
And you've done that extremely well. I, for the first time, am beginning to understand the root of this current crisis because you go right back in history. And I think perhaps if we could pick it up in the aftermath of World War I, can you tell us what happened and how that's influenced what's going on now?
So in the aftermath of World War I, Britain and France imposed a victor's peace on the Middle East. And the new order reflected the interests of the colonial powers, and it was in complete disregard of the rights and aspirations of the native population of the Middle East. And Britain, in particular, issued the Balfour Declaration in 1917. It was a declaration in support of the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. But remember that in 1917, the Jews were 10% of the population of Palestine. The Arabs were 90%, and yet Britain awarded national rights to the Jews and only civil and religious rights to the Arabs. And the Arabs were offensively described in the Balfour Declaration as the non-Jewish communities in Palestine. So it was a classic colonial document. It enabled the Zionist movement, a very small minority, to embark on the systematic takeover of the whole of Palestine, a process that continues today. So the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was made in Britain. Britain is responsible for this conflict. Zionism is a settler colonial movement, which has engaged in the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. And now, with the war in Gaza, Zionist settler colonialism has reached its peak. It's on the verge of committing genocide.
And of course, there was another major development after the Second World War.
After the Second World War, the Western powers had a sense of guilt for the Holocaust, because the Holocaust was not committed in the Arab world, it was committed in the heartland of Christian Europe. And the Holocaust, the annihilation of European Jewry, is the worst crime in the annals of human history. And this Western sense of guilt towards the Jews translated into wanting to make amends. And this took the form of the UN Partition Resolution of Palestine in 1947. The UN Partition Plan called for changing the British mandate for Palestine into two states, one Arab, one Jewish. The Jewish state came into existence in 1948. The Palestinian state never materialized. But the point I really want to emphasize is that Europe, the West, expunged their sense of guilt at the expense of the Palestinians, because Britain closed its gates to Jewish survivors from the Holocaust. America did not allow any Jews to go to America. The only place that Jews who survived the Holocaust could go was Palestine. And the Palestinians have always asked, why do we have to pay the price for Europe's sins? And there isn't a satisfactory answer as to why they had to bear the burden of the Holocaust.
The title of your book, Three Worlds, and we know those are Iraq, Britain and Israel, Memoirs of an Arab Jew. Why is the idea of an Arab Jew so controversial?
Because nationalism is a very divisive force and a very destructive force, and it divides people into us and them. And Marilyn Monroe, in her scrapbook, wrote, "Nationalism stops us thinking." And most people think of Marilyn Monroe as a dumb blonde. I think of her as a profound thinker. And what she was saying is that nationalism stops us relating to one another as human beings. So Israel is a nation state. Isaiah Berlin, the Jewish philosopher, used to say, the Jews are like any other people, only more so. And by the same token, Zionism, like any other nationalist movement, only more so. So Zionism has been a divisive force in the Middle East. It polarized the Middle East into Jews and Muslims, Israelis and Arabs, Israelis and Palestinians.
I mean, as you write, the categories of Jew and Arab were not always mutually exclusive. I mean, the two got along extremely well. I think you say that Jews had been in Iraq for 2,500 years before Muslims.
Long before Muslims. Jews had been in Iraq since the Babylonian exile 2.5 millennia ago. So we were not newcomers. We were not outsiders. We were there long before the emergence of Islam, and there was a very long tradition of religious tolerance. And in Iraq, the Jews were not the other. They did not stand out. They did not live in ghettos. The Jews were one minority among many in Iraq. Anti-Semitism is a European malady. Anti-Semitism was exported from Europe to the Middle East. And interestingly, there was no anti-Semitic literature in Arabic, so it had to be translated from European languages. So my book has aroused a lot of interest in the Arab world, because any Arab born after 1948 would have no idea that the face of the Middle East used to be very different, that there were so many Jews who lived in the Arab world. For my family and for myself in Iraq, Muslim-Jewish coexistence was nothing unusual. It wasn't a distant dream. It was the everyday reality. And the establishment of the State of Israel has changed all that and created the most deep bitter and fundamental conflict in the whole region.
Tell me about your life as a small child there, because you came from an affluent family, a well-to-do family with very impressive ancestry, and this was a lovely life.
We had a very privileged life in Iraq. My father was a very rich merchant. My parents had a very high social status. My mother was a lady of leisure. We had a sybaritic lifestyle, very luxurious lifestyle, and we had a lot of very good Muslim friends. And my mother used to talk a lot about our wonderful Muslim friends in Baghdad. And one day I asked her, did we have any Zionist friends? And she said, no, Zionism is an Ashkenazi thing. It's a European Jewish thing. Zionism is an Ashkenazi thing. It's nothing to do with us. So in Iraq, we and the whole Jewish community was well integrated into Iraqi society. When we arrived in Israel, we were outsiders. We left Iraq as Jews, and we arrived in Israel as Iraqis. And Israel was a very Ashkenazi, Eurocentric society, and the Zionists looked down on the Jews of the East. They looked down on us. And I, in Israel, had a chip on my shoulder. I had a deep sense of inferiority because I was an Iraqi boy, which governed my relationship with Israeli society. And my experience was typical of a whole generation of new immigrants from the Arab lands to Israel.
Why did you leave? Why did you leave Iraq?
In 1948, there was an Arab-Israeli war. The Iraqi army fought in Palestine. At the end of that war, Israel signed armistice agreements with all its neighboring Arab states, but not with Iraq, which isn't a neighboring state. So Iraq and Israel are still officially at war, but the Palestinians were defeated in 1948, and 750,000 Palestinians became refugees. The name Palestine was wiped off the map. This is the Nakba, the catastrophe. And after the Nakba, there was a backlash against the Jews throughout the Arab world, including in Iraq. The main reason for our leaving Iraq was persecution at the official level. There was hostility at the popular level after the 48, but more importantly, there was persecution of the Jews at the official level. Jews were fired from government service, restrictions were placed on Jewish merchants, quotas were imposed on the number of Jews who go to universities. So that was the climate in which the exodus happened. But there was another more specific reason for the exodus, and that is, I'll go one step back. In March 1950, the Iraqi government passed a law which said any Jew who wants to leave the country has a year to register to leave on a one-way visa. And not many Jews chose to leave because Iraq was their country. They had deep roots in the country. Israel was an alien country. So the exodus was not an ideological one, but one of necessity. Circumstances force us to leave. And there is one last point, and that is between 1950 and 51, 5 bombs exploded in Jewish premises, and that created a panic and accelerated the exodus. And in my book, I devote a whole chapter 7, to this episode. I call it Baghdad Bombshell, and I have new evidence to show that Israel activated Zionists in the underground in Baghdad, and that they were responsible for 3 out of the 5 bombs. So Israel was involved in the planting of bombs that frightened the Jews and forced them to leave Iraq. So the Jewish exodus from Iraq was a complex process. Israel played a part in it, but the end result was that in 1950 there were 135,000 Jews in Iraq, and by the end of 1952, only about 10,000 were left. They were not mistreated, but 125,000 Jews emigrated from Iraq to Israel.
The book then goes into your life in Israel in heartbreaking detail. We hear about you as a little boy being deeply embarrassed with your father speaking to you in Arabic on the street in front of your friends. We hear about your mother and her life and what she did to bolster the family. You were unhappy at school. You went off to England to do your O-levels there. You then came back to Israel and you had to do national service. Tell us about your time in the IDF.
So this was the mid-1960s, and I had already been indoctrinated with Zionism and Zionist history at school. And the IDF was a melting pot. And I served loyally and proudly in the IDF in the mid-1960s, because during my time, the IDF was true to its name. It was the Israel Defense Force. When the May 1967 crisis erupted, I was a first-year history student at Cambridge, and I went down to the Israeli embassy in London, and I said, I'm ready to go back to serve in the war that we all knew was coming. And they took my details, and I never heard from them again. And this was the only tutorial I missed in my 3 years as a student at Cambridge. But the Six-Day War changed everything. It was a real turning point in the history of the Middle East. And Israel, which was a small country, became a colonial power. It trebled its territory. It captured the Golan Heights, the West Bank, the Sinai Peninsula. And the IDF was transformed from a regular army into an army of occupation, into the brutal police force of a brutal colonial power. So my disenchantment with Israel began, it was very gradual, but it began in the aftermath of the Six-Day War. And Israel still claims that the IDF is the most moral army in the world. This is completely preposterous. Look at what the Israeli army is doing in Gaza today. It's brutal, it's destructive, it's vicious, and it's perpetrating genocide. So it's not that I who have changed. I still have the same values. It's Israel that has changed and has become not just a Zionist state, but a Jewish supremacist state and an apartheid state.
Would that be the case, whoever was in charge? If there was a change of government, if Netanyahu went, and we know that he's unpopular, would that change the face of the nation?
Netanyahu is uniquely selfish, and he needs a long war to remain in power, because he faces 3 serious charges of corruption, and he knows that once he ceases to be prime minister, he would stand trial, and he will probably end up in jail. That's why he's prolonging this war, regardless of the consequences, not just for the Palestinians, but for Israeli society as well. But Netanyahu isn't the problem, or it's not the only problem. The problem is that Israeli society has been steadily moving to the right ever since 2000, ever since the Second Intifada. And clear manifestations of this shift to the right is that in the government there are Jewish fascists. There is Bezalel Smotrich, the leader of religious Zionism. There is Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is the leader of Jewish Power. That's the name of his party, Jewish Power. The name itself is a fascist name. So we have Jewish fascists in the government, and they set the tone.
Is there anyone in the government that gives you hope?
Hope is too big a word. There is no one in that government who gives me hope. But there is the former chief of staff, who is the leader of a centrist party called Blue and White. So it's a centrist party and a nationalist party, and the likelihood is, if there is a new election, that the center parties would win a majority and there would be a center-right government as opposed to a right, ultra-right government. So there is some hope that Israel would move away from extreme nationalism, extreme Zionism, to more mainstream Zionism.
You recently joined in with British protesters chanting "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." Now, of course, we know that many Jews interpret that to mean get rid of all the Jews, get rid of Israel. What do you interpret it as meaning, and what do you believe?
So I went on the first big march against the war in Gaza, and I chanted "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." And my wife and daughter were with me. And Suella Braverman tells us that this is a call for the destruction of Israel. That's complete rubbish. For me, "From the river to the sea" means freedom for everybody who lives in that space. And for me, freedom is a core value. That's what I want. And I want equal rights for everybody who lives in that area. And there are also left-wingers, leftists in Israel. They chant "Mehanahar ad hayam, Demokratia lekulam," from the river to the sea, democracy for everybody. In Hebrew, it rhymes. And after this interview, I'm going to meet with my wife and daughter, and we are going to join the march. And I'll be chanting again, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." And this reflects where I am today politically. And in the epilogue to my book, I trace the evolution of Israel, my views on Israel-Palestine, down to the present day. I used to support a two-state solution, but the two-state solution is dead. Israel killed it with settlement expansion, and therefore today I support one democratic state from the river to the sea, with equal rights for all its citizens, regardless of religion or ethnicity. So that's what I stand for today.
Do you think that anti-Semitism is on the rise, particularly here in Britain? And do you also think that accusations of anti-Semitism and perhaps also anti-Zionism are being used to silence the critique of what Israel is doing?
Clearly, there is an upsurge of anti-Semitism in this country. It's well documented. Every time Israel launches an attack on Gaza, there is an upstick of anti-Semitic incidents. But now in the last 6 months, it's been quite dramatic. So anti-Semitism is a problem, but I really insist on drawing a clear distinction between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Anti-Semitism is the hatred of Jews because they are Jews. It's a crime. It's a horrible crime. Anti-Zionism is criticism of Zionism, the official ideology of the State of Israel, or more commonly, criticism of specific policies of the Israeli government, especially towards the Palestinians. And most of these criticisms are rational, logical, and evidence-based. The problem is that Israel and its supporters throughout the West deliberately, I repeat, deliberately conflate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism in order to silence legitimate criticisms of the State of Israel. That is a problem. And another problem is that our government is completely indifferent to Islamophobia, which is a more serious problem than anti-Semitism. But it uses anti-Semitism and the increase in anti-Semitic incidents for political purposes, to make political capital out of the suffering and anxieties of British Jews. That's deplorable.
Avi, just before we go, how do you see this ending?
I'm pessimistic in the short term, but optimistic in the long term, because I believe that apartheid in the 21st century is not sustainable. It's happening now, the most cruel kind of apartheid, and settler colonialism is unfolding before our eyes in Gaza. And the British government, the European government, and most importantly, the American administration support Israel and supply Israel with weapons and give Israel diplomatic protection at the UN. But this cannot last, and we can see student protests against the war in Gaza everywhere, in America in particular. This is similar to the student protest that happened against the Vietnam War from Berkeley to Berlin. So in the long run, and another factor, public opinion in Britain, in America, in Europe, is moving very rapidly against Israel and in support of the Palestinians. The governments are still pro-Israeli, but in the long run, civil society will influence government policy. The support for Israel will decline, and I'm sure that in the end, Israeli apartheid cannot last. And if you want me to predict, I predict that Israel would go the same way as South African apartheid.
Avi Shlaim, it's been an absolute privilege speaking to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure for me.
Three Worlds, Memoirs of an Arab Jew by Avi Shlaim is published by One World. And you've been listening to Meet the Writers, thanks to the production team of Tamsin Howard, Mariella Bevan and George Ruskin. You can download this show and previous episodes from our website or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening.